Hello, my name is Chad Donchermont. I'm the Executive Director of the Rennie Center for Education Research and Policy, an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization committed to ensuring educational decision-making is based on deep knowledge and evidence of effective practice. It is a privilege to speak with you this morning, introduce the work of the EdImpact Research Consortium, and engage with friends and allies on how we can best support districts and schools in recovering from the COVID pandemic. We all know schools are in crisis. A student starting third grade this year, a critical period when students shift from learning to read to reading to learn, has never experienced an uninterrupted year of schooling, be it through school closure or social isolation. Just this past week, the release of the 2022 National Assessment of Educational Progress, the nation's report card, found that Massachusetts students scored at their lowest levels in reading and math in 19 years. Students' performance in 8th grade reading was the lowest on record. This decline has largely been attributed to the disruption of learning during the pandemic. And at the same time, while learning remains unfinished, students, families, and educators are struggling with unprecedented mental health concerns. Since the start of COVID, the World Health Organization reports that the prevalence of anxiety and depression has increased by an alarming 25%. Mental health-related emergency room visits among adolescents have risen by roughly 1/3. Given that it takes an average of 8 to 10 years to receive treatment after the onset of mental health symptoms, schools have become a primary source of support and guidance. But recognizing the scale of this problem does not mean we're without solutions, without opportunities. The COVID pandemic has also clearly demonstrated the innovation of our school leaders, the commitment of our communities, and the talents and resilience of our students. Navigating school closures and reopenings has exposed numerous tools and strategies that may be leveraged to chart a path forward. In creating a recovery plan from the COVID pandemic, there are 3 keys to keep in mind that we will be discussing today. First, we have resources. The passage of the Federal Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER, has provided Massachusetts with $2.9 billion in federal aid. Boston itself is due to receive more than $275 million. These resources, combined with a dramatic increase in state funding through the Student Opportunity Act, provide not only the means to support students' academic recovery, but an opportunity to restructure our education system to better serve all students. Second, we know what works. Strategies such as the selection of high-quality curriculum through the state's Curate initiative, on-site instructional coaching, just-in-time individualized interventions like high-dosage tutoring, and intensive targeted supports like acceleration academies and summer learning can and have been effectively utilized to help students catch up. Similarly, the development of comprehensive school-based mental health systems in places like Methuen Public Schools that screen and support students' strengths and needs in a multi-tiered system of supports also demonstrate that we can attend to not only students' academic learning, but their social, emotional, physical, and mental health needs. And as an aside, if terms like high-dosage tutoring, acceleration academies, and tiered systems of support seem wonky and inaccessible, now is the time that we all need to start learning this nomenclature as a common and necessary part of daily education practice. No different than discussing morning circles or homeroom. In short, we know how to help students, and we have the resources to do it, which brings me to the 3rd key. As a field, we need to come together around common purpose and clear and specific goals for recovery built on a few primary strategies. We cannot continue to work independently, community by community, designing and implementing hundreds of disparate solutions and expect all students to benefit. This is the work of the EdImpact Research Consortium, currently a partnership of the Ceres Institute at Wheelock College, Boston University, Education Resource Strategies, the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, and the Rennie Center. and open to any other organization that wishes to partner. EdImpact seeks to support evidence-based spending, analyze the impact of COVID recovery funds, and provide a platform for the field to learn from one another and reflect on progress made. This is the work we will discuss today, centered around the 3 keys I have mentioned. And with this in mind, I am delighted to introduce our speakers who will share what they currently know about COVID recovery spending through ESSER and where we might go next. We are joined by Matt Deninger, Chief Strategy and Research Officer at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Priya Tihalani, Superintendent at Everett Public Schools, Annelise Buzaid, Director of Research at the Rennie Center, and Nate Schwartz, Ed Research for Recovery, Professor of Practice at Brown's Annenberg Institute of School Reform. Full bios for all of our speakers will be shared with the slides from all of these presentations following the event, and we're delighted to have their expertise with us. And now it is my privilege to hand off to the Rennie Center's Director of Policy, Alexis Leon, who will walk us through today's agenda and facilitate the program. Thank you. Alexis?
Thank you so much, Chad. Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis Leon, and I am delighted to be here today. As you can see, we have a jam-packed agenda, so I won't take up too much time. A few logistical notes. So we do have the Q&A function working. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use that tool throughout the presentation. My colleague in this work, James Michalowski from MBAE, will be moderating these questions behind the scenes, and we will be sure to get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Also, please feel free to use the hashtag EdImpact on any social media platform you feel comfortable using to continue the conversation. So to kick off our conversation today, we have 4 wonderful speakers who will be providing their perspective on and their role in COVID relief funds. Our first speaker today is Matt Deninger. Matt, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Alexis and Chad. Thank you for having me. My name is Matt Deninger. I'm the Chief Strategy and Research Officer at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And one of my the many hats I wear is to oversee our federal major grant programs, and the ESSER grants, as Chad mentioned earlier, fall under that. So you can go to the next slide. I'm happy to give you the context, sort of where we've been and where we are now with respect to the huge amount of funding of about $3 billion that we received from the federal government in COVID relief funds. So if you could click, we can see where we are today. There we are. So as you can see, there are 3 huge tranches of money that we got from the federal government, and we just call them affectionately ESSERs 1, 2, and 3. ESSER 1, each one of these funding streams lasted about 2 years and 3 months, so 27 months. And you can see that since the beginning of the pandemic, we're now at the point where ESSER 1 is done, which is kind of crazy to think about. That was about $200 million. And just to give you perspective on how much money that is, Massachusetts each year for its annual Title I grant from the federal government, it's around $230 million, I would say. So this was basically the first tranche of money was almost as much as what districts get each year for Title I. So it was a good chunk of money. And incidentally, each of these tranches of money were distributed to all 400 districts in Massachusetts equitably. So using the Title I formula, which means that more money went to those districts that were most in need, that have the most and highest concentrations of economically disadvantaged students. So that was in March of 2020. ESSER 1 comes along. ESSER 2 came along in late December of 2020, and that was $739 million. So an enormous amount of money that the districts had never seen a federal award that big, and we had never seen a federal award that big. So basically, 3 times what a normal sort of Title I grant would be. And then, not 4 months later, in April of 2021, you get ESSER 3, which is that much more, $1.66 billion. So you have a lot of money here, especially the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, in rapid succession, more money than the districts had ever seen for COVID relief. So there is a lot of money on the table. That is for sure, and districts have been spending. You can click and go to the next slide. Here we are as of, I would say, just a couple weeks ago. ESSER 1, as I showed you, is basically done. These are I want to be very clear about this. These are claims versus unclaimed. Which all of these grants are reimbursement grants. So the districts get the money as an award. They don't actually get the money, but they're like, you can spend this much money. You've applied to DESE, we've approved your application, and so you have license to go spend this much money. You go spend it, and then we will reimburse you. And so these are basically reimbursements paid. So 99% of ESSER 1 has been paid out. And we are expecting that the last 2 million or so will be claimed, just over the next few weeks. We expect that to go down. ESSER 2 spending is actually going at a pretty good clip right now. We're at about 60% of ESSER 2 being spent. That expires next September 30th. And then ESSER 3, you can see the districts are still slowly spending ESSER 3, but it's a huge amount of money, and that will expire in September of 2024. So there's still a decent runway. Yeah, you can click. Deadlines are approaching, and if you look at it in total, we have about $912 million claimed. And so that's about 35% of all of those ESSERs together claimed at this point. You can go to the next slide. So we've taken a look at, okay, so how are districts spending this? And really what we can look at now is planned spending, because we have their applications, we have their budgets. Districts have been approved to spend this money for well over a year now, that everyone has access to the money. So we decided that we were going to pull data from all, well, there's 400 districts and 3 major grants, so that's 1,200 budgets. We painstakingly pulled data from these budgets and summarized them into broad categories of spending, so we could see the trends. What are districts spending on? Just a few caveats with the data that I'm going to show you. Planned spending can change. So if things come up in districts, they can always amend their grants, and we can work with them as long as it's necessary, reasonable, and allowable. We can have them amend. And these categories, there's probably some overlap in them. These are broad categories. So if you were to have a mental health specialist during summer school, would you categorize it as mental health, or would you categorize it spending as summer school? I don't know. And so I think we put that in summer school. But anyway, you can just to caveat that there are some overlaps. So you can go to the next slide, and so we can see. So this is a bar graph that shows the colors are the different ESSER dollars. So ESSER 3, ESSER 2, and ESSER 1. And some interesting things with this slide that you can see the categories along the bottom. Addressing unfinished learning is by far the biggest planned spending category for the ESSER funds. And not surprisingly, it was mostly ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 funds, because most of the ESSER 1 funds were spent for, the immediate COVID needs at the beginning of the pandemic. You see education technology, COVID health response, operational things in the blue there at the bottom for the ESSER 1 funds. But as ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 start to fill in the picture, you start to see more along the lines of addressing unfinished learning for all populations, addressing unfinished learning for special populations, or having specialists for special populations. You see a lot of ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 dollars going into facilities, improving air quality, HVAC systems, and then on down the line, you can see all the major categories that the districts are spending their money on. And you can click to the next slide. I think this is my last slide, just to give you a sense of the coverage. Okay, like the spread of this money, how many districts, what percentage of districts are using dollars in each of these categories. You can see every single district is using ESSER funds for to address unfinished learning and for mental health. COVID health response is another very popular one, and really, the facilities and air quality in the summer school, those only about 64% are using money for facilities and air quality, and for summer school about 60%, and that is because, as I said before, we have 400 districts in Massachusetts, and because of the spread of these dollars going to the most economically disadvantaged concentrations of students in districts, you have some districts that have gotten a lot of money, but there's plenty of districts that got more moderate amounts of money. So they might not have gotten enough money to do a major HVAC upgrade in their buildings. So I think that's also important to keep in mind, that this was a windfall for quite a number of districts, but there are also quite a number of districts in Massachusetts, and variation is usually the rule here in Massachusetts. And so there are plenty of districts that got a more modest, moderate amount of money that might have said, hey, really, we just need to use this on addressing unfinished learning, because we can't afford an HVAC project with these dollars. So I hope this gives you a good context and a good background and a good sense of where we are now for spending the ESSER dollars, and also gives you some idea of where these districts are thinking about spending their dollars.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. All right, we are going to turn it over to Priya. And I will pull up her presentation in just a moment. Priya, if you can join.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today at the EdImpact Research Consortium. I'm excited to speak to you about the ways that we here in the Everett Public Schools have used our ESSER dollars to address the needs of our students. So next slide, please. Very next one, sorry. There you go. Thank you. So to begin, I just wanted to give you an overview of the different phases of ESSER funding that our district has had access to since the start of the pandemic. So ESSER 1, as Matt mentioned, is over now. For us, that was about $1.5 million in total. We received it in the summer of 2020, and it was immediately deployed to meet our most urgent remote learning needs, such as Chromebooks, Wi-Fi hotspots, translations and interpretation services, and summer support. ESSER 2 and 3, which have added up to about $19 million, are ongoing and have focused on our longer term plans that have still included technical and operational needs such as PPE and COVID testing, but have also been able to address academic and social recovery. The next slide. Yes, perfect. So when we began planning the use of our dollars back at the end of 2020, we actually started by developing a multi-year budget investment plan that was built around two major tenets, which were our core values and our whole child development approach. It's been a living document, not just a static list of numbers, which has been really critical because we needed flexibility in order to meet the ever-evolving needs that have emerged over the past 2 years. So to start, our core values are integrate, access, empower, and cultivate. And we use these as our guideposts for any decision, any priority building, and ultimately any budget creation. Aligned to our core values also is our overall approach to educating all students. And we in the EPS use a whole child development approach to ensure that we're supporting all areas of a student's development and learning. We envision there to be 5 components to this approach. One component is rich instructional experiences. A second is positive developmental relationships. Third is environments filled with safety and belonging. Fourth are integrated supports, and that includes extracurriculars and enrichment programs. And last is the intentional development of mindsets and skills. And I bring all of this up because I think what is even more important sometimes than what districts have spent the money on is how we created our plans, and whose input we use to create our plan. So our idea for creating this multi-year budget investment plan was that we wanted to be very intentional and strategic with the use of our ESSER funds so that it would help us meet the goals that we would have had for our district even without the pandemic. So next slide, thank you. So here you see year 2 of our multi-year budget plan, which gives you a glimpse into how we sort of aligned each investment, not only to one of our core values, but also to one of the components of our whole child approach to, again, make sure it was in line with our overall district strategy. So to give you one example, we focused on creating tailored supports for families, such as creating a family engagement manager who oversees 16 multilingual family liaisons. And that team creates several adult learning opportunities for our families, such as Tech Goes Home classes, adult ESL, and even supports with college coursework. So these investments align to our core value of empowering stakeholders, in this case, our parents, by giving them the tools they need to support their children. And this investment is also aligned to the component of the whole child development, which encourages positive developmental relationships between students and the many influential people in their lives. So like I said, it's not just important to us how we created our plans, but also with whose input we created our plans. And we started by getting community feedback. So parents, staff, local businesses, students responded to an ESSER survey that we put online and pushed out in hard copies so that we could hear from everyone regarding what they believed we needed in order to support students after or even amidst the pandemic. So not at all surprising was that the most popular choice was mental health supports. Enhancing core instruction through tutoring and mentoring was also a top priority. Other priorities were to expand our offerings and accessibility to career and technical programs, which I actually did find surprising, and also to enhance and to add to our curriculum and to, of course, continue our health and safety supports and measures. So we used this feedback to determine our final priorities, which led us to divvying up our funds into these buckets for our ESSER application: capital improvements and investments, instructional rigor, social emotional support, supplemental services, and tailored family supports, which I mentioned previously. So next slide, please. So our final investments all fall into one of these categories that, again, are also aligned to our core values and our whole child development approach. So in the bucket of instructional rigor, we have been revamping and expanding our CTE program as asked, as well as ensuring that all of our students have equal access to every pathway or program that we already have. We also hired key positions such as K-8 STEM and literacy managers who have formed a series of curriculum review teams that are currently choosing new curriculums and vetting resources and practices for equity, relevance, and rigor. We also created an equity team led by a chief equity officer, and we have begun an entire overhaul of our library spaces and services. And this year, we're excited about offering many after-school opportunities, including a robotics program for middle school students. So we're fielding 1 or even 2 teams at all of our 5 elementary schools. And this effort is being led by a coordinator and school-based coaches, all of course, who are ESSER funded. As the survey showed, again, physical health still remains a top priority, which we addressed with several capital improvements, including installing new filtration systems in our water, touch-free hand dryers, and just implemented ongoing disinfection processes that will be in place now moving forward. To address the mental health, we created a social emotional learning team that's complete with school clinicians and overseen by Director of Selwell. We invested in social emotional curriculum. We also trained teachers on how to create calming corners in each of their classrooms and provided funding for them to do so. In partnership with Cambridge Health Alliance, we have offered mental health first aid training to our staff and offered them the opportunity to be trained as coaches themselves so that this could be a sustainable effort over time. And instead of having hall monitors at the high school, for example, whose very nature was very punitive, we replaced that team with a team of student success coaches who partner with our educators and school leaders to provide students with the supports they need to be successful. So we really tried to use ESSER as an opportunity to look at all of our structures differently. For supplemental services, we now have a supplemental services manager who oversees a breadth of our new programs like MPOW, Kids in Tech, Cadets, and Livius Prep. Our supplemental services also included Day 6, or a Saturday program, in which students who have dropped out from EHS can come back to attain their high school diploma. So we made many phone calls last year to do recruitment, and we graduated 11 students at our first ever Day 6 graduation ceremony this past August, which stands to me as one of the top highlights, not only of my tenure, but of our ESSER spending. We've also greatly expanded our summer programming. Before, the district used to offer summer academic enrichment at one school, and we now run half-day programs at almost all of our schools. We also offer a series of one-week athletic camps that leverage the skills and talents of our coaches and our student alumni. We offer tutoring and mentoring by contracting with local universities and organizations to ensure one-to-one support for our students. And we've also added 5 teams of 8 City Year core members at our various schools, making us the first district outside of Boston to utilize City Year, which is why it is now called City Year Greater Boston and not just City Year Boston. So as for tailored supports for families, in addition to all of those that I mentioned previously, as you all know, we've had an influx of families from other countries entering our schools, even more so than in previous years. So this year we have started monthly orientation sessions for newcomer families, and the sessions are held in person in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And again, this is one of the many ways that we have used our ESSER dollars to help support our needs as they've evolved. So next slide. So speaking of which, over the last 2 years, much has changed and we have learned a lot. And we have been very fortunate that the ESSER process has allowed us to be flexible, which has been a huge advantage given there have been so many rapid shifts, not only of COVID, but the conditions we've discovered upon returning to school. So for example, initially, we wanted to build out teams of professionals to fill in some of the gaps in services that we already had by hiring nurses, academic recovery advisors, teacher developers, trainers. But when we returned last year, not only did we find it difficult to hire for those positions, but we also found another greater need, which was security. Students were having a lot of trouble reacclimating to school, and there was a great deal of conflict amongst students, much of which unfortunately was physical in nature. So obviously these issues demonstrated that our investments in social emotional wellness were definitely needed, but we also had to pivot and use some of our resources to make investments in cameras, identification cards, and other security measures. Additionally, some of the tutoring services that we had planned for actually had to be bargained with our unions. So that created some additional complications and lag time for getting those services to our students. And finally, while it has been so wonderful to be back in school, and there has definitely been a greater sense of stability and normalcy since we have returned, like many other school districts, we have had many staff transitions, which has certainly made it difficult to ensure consistency across all of our many efforts. But still, even amidst those challenges, overall, the ESSER dollars really have been crucial to ensuring our recovery. And I think we've implemented a lot of innovative practices and programs with these funds that I think have proved so promising that we are committed to continuing them into the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Superintendent. And thank you for bearing with me. My mouse, I think, had too much coffee this morning, so it was like really running through the presentation at the beginning there. So thank you for that presentation. I really appreciate it. All right, so we are going to turn it over now to my colleague here at the Rennie Center, Annelise. Take it away.
All right. Well, it's exciting to follow the district perspective. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity just to share a bit more. I know Chad opened it up with sharing a bit about the EdImpact Consortium and our work, but I'll kind of dive into the core components of this work for a few minutes here. So the consortium really has a few primary goals. The first being to support district leaders in particular, to make evidence-informed, high-leverage spending decisions. And we also have some other goals that really are public facing. So one is just to help the field understand the state of COVID spending, COVID investments in Massachusetts, as well as to really produce some forward-thinking research that can, ESSER won't be around forever, but really to help us take the lessons learned from ESSER and inform decision-making in the education sector well into the future. So you can see the core components here, but I'll share about each of them on the next few slides. So the first component, and really a place that we started with this work, was creating a data dashboard. So Matt obviously shared about the state of spending in Massachusetts, and he also mentioned how districts had submitted applications to DESE. So we took a look at these applications to really see how are districts planning to invest these ESSER funds. ERS, one of our partners here on the consortium, identified what they called 5 power strategies. And these are things that are really well aligned, have a robust evidence base, and also point to real sustainable long-term improvement in the sector. So things like time and attention, family and community partnerships, relationships and social emotional supports. So what our data dashboard does is take a look at the ways that districts had planned to invest their ESSER funds and map them to these power strategies to see kind of how districts plan to use these funds. So we can go ahead and take a look at just how the data dashboard is laid out. So you can see here, this is our landing page. If we scroll down, you can see the districts we've looked at. We have about 24 communities whose plans that we looked at. And you can see these charts that really show a breakdown of the, how the planned investments map to these power strategies. So if we navigate, we'll go ahead and take a look at Fall River. So this is one of the districts that we looked at the way they plan to use their ESSER funds. If you look under the by dollar amount chart that's being shown here, you can see how the bulk of the funds are really mapped to this time and attention. So things that would provide more individualized instruction to accelerate students' learning. And if we scroll down a bit further, you can see how they have a lot of planned personnel investments. So Fall River is planning to bring on teachers, paras, and other staff, really to provide some of that more individualization to students to really support their acceleration. So that's a bit about how you can go ahead and, in your own time, click through and see how some of these other communities are using these funds. So that's a bit of the data dashboard. The second component is a resource toolbox. So again, aligned to these 5 power strategies, we went through resources that have been created by all different organizations across the nation. And provided them for districts. So if a district wants to say, you can see this screenshot here, wanted to invest in high quality instructional materials, the resource toolbox provides some tangible things that they can look at both to select materials as well as to come up with an implementation plan. The toolbox was really driven by some feedback that we had gotten from districts early on in ESSER that they just felt as they were trying to make their plans that the internet had really been flooded with guidance for districts, some really high quality guidance, some that was not well aligned with districts. And it was difficult with everything going on for each district to go in and really assess, like, okay, is this tool well aligned with the evidence base? Is this something we should be relying upon? So that's why we created this sort of vetted toolbox that's available for districts. The next piece that the consortium does is convenings. So we obviously are in the midst of one right now. And then we have some workshops coming up over the next few months that are really geared towards a district audience. We've got 2 workshops coming up, one the end of this month, one in December, that really focus on do now strategies for districts, things that districts can take the funds they have and really implement right now in real time to move the needle on student learning. And then in the spring, we're really going to shift our focus to thinking of kind of bold, longer term, evidence-backed innovations and support districts in thinking what are some steps they could take to really use these last couple of years of ESSER funding to seed some things that can be really transformative in the long run. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about a piece of our work that's been really exciting, which is direct support for 6 districts in Massachusetts, which we've done in partnership with Ed Research for Recovery. You'll hear from our colleague Nate from there in just a few minutes. So really where this work came from is we met with a number of district leaders last winter, and what we were hearing from them was, as we've all been mentioning today, ESSER is an enormous infusion of resources, and the time that districts had to plan for it was an incredibly, unprecedented and crazy time where they're trying to figure out some real immediate COVID issues, getting students back to school, as well as plan for how they were gonna, leverage these funds. So in partnership with the Ed Research team and districts that gave us feedback, we came up with an approach to support districts, which was to do a quick dive, like really kind of try to be as non-time intensive as possible for the districts, but to really look at their practices in the areas where they were investing ESSER funds. So we looked in particular at academic acceleration and mental health. We used a tool, which I'll share about in a few minutes, to see how well the practices that districts were putting in place with ESSER funds aligned to the evidence base, and then partnered with districts to create a roadmap. So based on the findings that we saw, what are areas, what are things that they could invest in, practices that they could shift to better align their work with the evidence base and hopefully have a bigger impact on student outcomes ultimately. So our partners are listed here. You just heard from one of them. 5 of these partners are sort of towards the end of their work with us, and one of them is just getting started. So we're continuing the work into this fall. So one piece I wanted to share that we're really excited about is this evidence alignment tool that we use that was developed by the Ed Research team, which really provided a series of research-backed look-fors of, okay, if you're investing in high dosage tutoring, here are the things that would make a tutoring program well aligned with the evidence base. And we use this evidence alignment tool both for focus groups and interview probes we used, as well as to guide our summary of findings that we gave to all districts, and to then support districts in prioritizing after they'd gotten our summary of findings, what are the things they wanted to tackle immediately in terms of their roadmap for their future work. So you can see here that we have kind of 5 areas that districts have invested in, things like high dosage tutoring, intervention blocks, instructional coaching. And I'm also just going to share a few of the takeaways we've had from this work. So it's been an incredible learning experience for us just to see what the districts were working on and learn from it. Some of the things we took away were there are so many worthwhile investments, and we really saw that when districts prioritize a small number of high leverage priorities, they were best able to really move the work forward. Another piece we saw is there's incredible hesitance when you're seeing really big, concerning kind of academic data to prioritize things that strengthen belonging and connection. But we know that ultimately these things are really key to improving student well-being. Another piece we saw is tons of districts investing in high quality instructional materials, which is a really great investment, well backed by evidence. But we know that this moves the needle the most when it's paired by really robust implementation support over the long term for teachers. Another piece was tutoring programs, just focusing on going deep, intensive, time intensive for really a select number of students is shown to have a real benefit. And then a last piece is just really thinking about data. Lots of districts have invested in data systems with ESSER funds, but we know that there's a real feeling of data overwhelm that we heard about from teachers. So thinking of kind of narrowing in on a set of actionable indicators and helping everyone understand how to act on those within their locus of control are really powerful strategies. So those are some of the takeaways, and I would also be remiss if I didn't just publicly share how impressed we've been by the districts we've worked with. The way that I think what Priya described was so emblematic of what we saw in districts, that as they were making these plans, they were keeping students, their most important stakeholders, their student and family feedback really at the center of their decision making, which has just been such a encouraging and exciting thing to see. So we're thrilled to have the opportunity to kind of track this over the long term.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annelise. I really appreciate it. All right. And last but not least, as Annelise mentioned, we have Nate to round out our speaker panel. Thank you so much. Nate, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll be quick because I know that I want people to have time for questions. But so I'm here representing Ed Research for Recovery, which is an initiative that I co-founded back in 2020 when it became clear that there was an immense demand for better, more specific research on the kinds of things that districts could do around COVID recovery, and that those resources weren't there. And it's sort of interesting because what we've seen is that these issues, the issues that districts are taking on right now, are sort of unprecedented in scope, but actually issues that we've studied year after year. And so we're thinking about things like disrupted learning. We're thinking about things like lack of engagement. And what I'm going to try to talk about today, if you flip the slide here, is the way the interaction, this sort of small space on the diagram that you see in front of you, between what we think of as research-based design principles, how schools can actually attack these problems according to what research has shown us, versus what we're seeing in district plans, versus what we're seeing in reality. And I think Priya did a really good job anticipating this by describing the incredible work that's going on in Everett schools and the ways that they have had to change on the fly according to both what seemed to be the priorities back in 2020 and now how things are shifting on the ground. If you flip the slide again, the way this work started was by starting to build out a library of research briefs about the challenges facing education leaders and the ways those have changed over the last few years. And so what we have on our site is a library of 25 briefs that include both some overviews about how can you think about taking on student trauma? How can you think about what do we know about ways to combat disrupted learning? But we also try to go much deeper than many of the resources that are out there in terms of, again, sort of how you design around these things within a district. So if you flip the slide again, what we start with are some very high-level takeaways about what schools can do. And this is what I meant about research-based design principles. I actually think we know a lot about how to take on pandemic disrupted learning. I think we know a lot about student mental health and well-being, about family and community partnerships. And you can see some of these look-fors. These are the look-fors that got built into that mapping tool that Annelise just described. As we look at these plans, and we're doing a lot of this work across the country, specifically in places like Rhode Island, where I'm from, but we look for whether or not plans include things like coherent instructional systems built around high-quality curriculum. Alongside that tier 1 work, we look for tightly designed supplementary acceleration interventions, such as high-impact tutoring. We think about how that works alongside the comprehensive screening and monitoring happening for student mental health and well-being. And I will note that we've seen this again and again over the past few years, that the places that actually take on student engagement, connections between adults and students in the building, are also the places that make the most progress around accelerating learning. So these aren't so much separate buckets as connected. We look for restorative practices. We look for positive behavioral interventions. And we look for the ways that districts are working directly with stakeholders and engaging parents, engaging families, but also engaging community partners. So that's sort of where we start. If you look at our briefs, one of the things that I think is nice about them, if you go to the next slide, is that we start with these high-level look-fors, but we get very deep into the details of what this might look like. So we're here. I don't know if this isn't quite showing up on my computer, but you can see that these are design principles for high-impact tutoring. So when you look to the research, we see there's been so much talk about this idea that tutoring is one of the most effective ways for catching kids up who are multiple grade levels behind. And that's true, but it's true when we mean something specific by tutoring. And what we mean is actually very different than the kinds of sort of after-school help programs that a lot of us participated in, that a lot of us have seen in schools over the years. So when we're looking for high-impact tutoring, we're looking for these very, very specific design principles that make it most likely that students catch up. So I want to start there. These are the high-level look-fors that we think about in district plans. And one of the things that we've done over the past couple of years is try to see whether or not schools are actually spending ESSER money in these ways, alongside all the sort of health and safety initiatives that several people talked about at the beginning of this panel. If you go to the next slide. So far, I would say the number one takeaway is that the ways that we see schools investing seem very aligned with the look-fors that we're asking for from the research. But we've also gone deeper in a few places like Rhode Island. And here's the way this is played out in district plans. People proposed a tremendous amount of proposed hiring. On the academic side, we see districts advertising and posting positions for teachers, for tutors, for interventionists, for classroom aides. On the non-academic side, behavioral interventionists, counselors, social workers, psychologists. We see major investments to shore up previous commitments around curriculum. And I think it's sort of interesting if you think about what schools are getting for the short term versus what they're investing in for the long term. So the hope is both that this money, this tremendous amount of money, as Matt described, is being put toward both things that will immediately help students who are in the building right now, but also pay off 5 to 10 years from now as schools are stronger because of this infusion of cash. And I think there's a lot of possibility around what we're seeing in terms of curriculum materials and curriculum-based PL. A last point, though, is that on the sort of non-academic side, we saw the expansion of wraparound services, but and so here I'm thinking about things like multi-tiered systems of support. Lots of schools are shoring up their multi-tiered systems of support by hiring additional staff to add interventions. But this is still all happening within a system that already existed, and within a system that I would argue has been weak, was weak long before the pandemic. So we aren't seeing great coordination with other social service agencies, and we aren't seeing schools really restructure themselves to serve what have been just skyrocketing mental health needs, and again, that were skyrocketing before 2019. And so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is what would it look like to use these funds in a different way that really provided a different kind of mental health support for students. One last slide. So those are the plans, and I think that's what we've talked about most today. This idea of our schools saying they're going to invest their money in research-aligned ways to take on major needs. I think there's no question that that is true, but if you go to the next slide, I still think that actually that doing this has been a struggle. Sorry, I don't know if you can see the animated part at the bottom, but maybe if you go one more. Oh, sorry, go back. I'm not sure why this font below is so light, but what we've seen is that actually district plans are not necessarily what is actually happening when districts turn around to invest the money. And I think that's for three reasons. First of all, there is just a capacity struggle, right? In terms of people, but also in terms of the kinds of technical assistance that you need to set up these programs. So when we talk about things like high impact tutoring, creating the high impact tutoring program turns out to be a tremendous amount of work. It turns out to be a tremendous amount of work because you need so many trained people. It turns out to be a tremendous work because you need to reshuffle school schedules in order to make this possible. And it turns out to be a tremendous amount of work because of the coordination that is needed between what is going on in the classroom and what is going on in a tutoring session. And that design capacity is often not there in districts, coupled with the fact that the staffing supply, that it's hard to find the people. And this is especially true. Priya talked about this around, say, trained nurses or trained psychologists or trained counselors. So many of these plans call for more of those people. And what we have seen when we've looked across districts is that districts are posting those positions and people aren't answering the call. And so again, there's sort of this on the fly shift that needs to be made, coupled with the fact that actually what people in districts are asking for, teachers, students, does not necessarily line up always with what we're seeing in terms of these plans. So I just think that we are at sort of this incredible inflection point, and now I'll end and move to questions. But we're at this incredible inflection point where there are more resources pouring into the system than have ever been available before. Districts have created plans that are really intentional and purposeful about taking on some of the challenges. But doing that in reality has been a challenge, and districts are actually reshuffling on the fly in order to take on this new landscape. And what we'll see over the next few years will determine whether or not we can see again sort of this investment that pays off over the long term for students. And I'm excited to join that discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate it. All right. I'm going to bring Chad back now, and as well as my colleague James from MBAE, and we're going to hop into some next steps and questions. But first, Chad, I will turn it over to you on some next steps.
Sure. So just to give us a sense of where we're headed, leaving time for Q&A. I know we're scheduled to end at 9:30 and we will lose some of our speakers, but I do want the audience to know that Annelise and I are happy to stay on past the half hour and can continue answering questions for a little bit if there are more coming in. In terms of where we're headed next, I do want to emphasize there is a lot of information here. These presentations have all been rich, but they have been packed with information, and navigating ESSER can feel a little bit like doing your taxes. 2 points to take away. One is we do not expect to resolve everything today. Of course not. We want this to be an ongoing dialogue that the field is having with each other to address many of the things that Nate and Annelise brought up. Second, we do hope that EdImpact will serve as a hub, sort of bring people together and to examine the data, use the resource toolkit, and think about implementation strategies to make sure that decisions at the district, at the local level, are evidence-based to help move us forward. In order to do that, some next steps, we are piloting a new focal area for evidence alignment reviews in special education, so stay tuned for that. We'll be producing a full written report with some of the lessons learned that have been shared today from the districts and intermediaries that we're already working with. And as Annelise mentioned, we'll be hosting a series of workshops specifically designed for practitioners to take this knowledge and help provide direct support in implementing some of those focused high leverage strategies. And then finally, of course, if you are a state or district leader who is looking for more support or guidance, or a policymaker or advocate who wants to get more engaged, please reach out to us directly. We're happy to work with folks on a one-on-one basis and want to make those connections. And you can see Alexis's contact information here. Final note, again, lots of information. So please, this session is being recorded. Slides will be shared. The website is up. Please go to that and review the material. And we're happy to continue to be supportive in navigating your way through it. So with that, Alexis, I think we have time for some questions, or James may be hopping on here.
Perfect. Yeah, James, I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Sounds great. Thanks, Alexis. And again, asked a great question in the chat about teacher professional development and how these funds are being used for PD and mentoring to modernize their instructional practice and increase their belief in effectiveness and job satisfaction. Annelise, I wonder if there's anything from the work you've been doing with districts that you want to respond to here. I know Matt typed in a great response, but wanted to invite you to add on to that.
Yeah, no, and thanks so much for this question, and Matt's responses in the chat, incredibly helpful. One thing we did see with districts is, teacher professional development has been a focus of so much of this ESSER funding. A lot of the priorities districts are moving forward involve PD of some form. And we know that research on PD is that not all, PD is created equal. So when districts are taking any new initiative, especially there's lots of research behind curriculum implementation that just kind of the one-time, two-time PD isn't going to move the needle. It's really about creating kind of structures, things like common planning time that have an ongoing, really robust, really, system of professional learning that extends both in kind of learning new materials or learning a new initiative, but also teachers taking the action, taking the leadership, problem solving, planning together, maybe even using strategies with each other that really research has shown is long-term kind of leads to the most dramatic gains.
Thanks, Annelise. I know we're coming up on time, but I wonder if we can kind of close out, and I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question in the chat. The EdImpact team will follow up with folks as necessary, but thinking about going forward, I know a lot of folks are wondering about how we will kind of sustain some of the work that is being seeded with this ESSER funding as we think about going beyond 2024, and especially with SOA funding continuing to flow over those years. Priya, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the forward-looking strategy. How are you all thinking about sustaining some of the great work that you're seeding with these ESSER funds?
Absolutely. And this is definitely something that is constantly on our mind. Our chief financial officer, while we were making the plan, while we've been implementing the plan, has constantly been reminding us, that we don't want to go over a fiscal cliff in year 2024. So how are we planning ahead for that? So what we're doing is we're constantly going back and assessing the budget investments, the budget investment plan. And there are certain areas where we're not going to require a sustained investment. So they are kind of one-time investments, which is great. We've also tried our best to keep as much personnel not on ESSER, but of course we've definitely had personnel on ESSER. And so for those, we are actually looking at what are ways that we can offset those costs, either through grants. We're already starting to look at like non-traditional grants that we could potentially leverage. Also, we are hoping to be able to demonstrate with the data that we've made gains in certain areas with some of the expenses, and thus try to advocate for greater spending from the municipality. Everett is a city that was hit very hard, and so we have not had money over net school spending, but we've had the ESSER dollars, so we are hoping that we will be able to get some investment from the city. But we do also have programs that we know, for example, we're earmarking for certain local businesses that we know are interested in those efforts and might be able to kind of offset those costs. But I think another thing with ESSER is it has also allowed us to kind of be innovative and try different things. And what I will say is there are things that show greater gains that we're going to be more invested in keeping over time, but it has allowed us to also experiment. We have found that not everything we've done is successful and will require a sustained investment. So it's really about looking at what our data shows us and where we need to really focus on sustaining those efforts moving forward.
Thanks so much, Priya. Alexis, I'll kick it back to you to close us out, or Chad, perhaps.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. We really appreciate it. We will make sure that we get to all of the questions that we can following the presentation. We will follow up. Thank you so much to our speakers for being here today and sharing your perspective and expertise. We will also be sure to share the slides with folks who have registered today. So we look forward to continuing the conversation. And thank you so much for your partnership in this work. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.